The Last Wizard, a Supernatural Romance. A story by Nini Peters. The first thing you need to understand about being the last of your kind is that you don't know it until the moment everything goes wrong. And for me, Kael Ashborne, that moment came on a Tuesday night when the world decided to show me exactly how little I knew about myself. I'd been living quietly in the Thornwick Valley for 19 years, raised by Mira, a woman who hadn't spoken a word since the day she found me as a baby, abandoned at her doorstep. She was an herbalist, one of those gentle souls who could coax healing from the most stubborn plants and brew remedies that worked like magic. Which I supposed they were. Mira never told me much about my past. How could she? But her eyes would grow distant sometimes when she looked at me, like she was seeing ghosts I couldn't perceive. I figured everyone had secrets in a world where vampires ruled the night and the rest of us learned to keep our heads down. The vision started when I turned 18. Flashes of things that felt like memories but couldn't be mine. Ancient towers reaching toward starlit skies, books that glowed with their own inner light, and always, this overwhelming sense of power that made my chest ache with longing. I told myself they were just dreams, the product of a young man's overactive imagination. I was wrong about that too. The vampire attack happened just after midnight. I'd been walking back from the village market, taking the long way home because the night air felt good against my skin and I'd never been afraid of the dark. Maybe I should have been. 3 of them emerged from the shadows between the oak trees, pale, beautiful, and deadly in that way that vampires perfected over centuries of predation. The leader, a woman with silver hair and eyes like cut glass, smiled at me with teeth that gleamed white in the moonlight. Well, she purred, circling me like I was prey. Which I supposed I was. What do we have here? A little lamb wandering alone? I should have run. Any sensible person would have run. But something about her presence made my skin crawl and my blood sing at the same time, and before I could stop myself, I was standing straighter, meeting her gaze with a boldness I didn't know I possessed. I'm not a lamb, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. She laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. No? Then what are you, little boy? That's when it happened. The moment that changed everything. I felt something deep inside my chest crack open, like an egg hatching or a flower blooming, and suddenly the air around me shimmered with golden light. Power, raw, ancient, and completely beyond my understanding, poured out of me in waves. The vampires shrieked and stumbled backward, their perfect faces twisting in pain and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Impossible, the silver-haired vampire gasped, her voice no longer smooth and predatory but sharp with panic. There are no more wizards. We made sure of that. Wizard. The word hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly those visions made terrible, wonderful sense. The towers, the glowing books, the sense of power, they weren't dreams at all. They were memories. Genetic memories passed down through bloodlines that were supposed to be extinct. I am Kael Ashborne and I am the last wizard. The vampires fled that night, but I knew they'd be back. Word would spread through their kind like wildfire. The last heir to the wizard order had been found. Within hours, every supernatural creature on the continent would know my name and want me either dead or under their control. Mira was waiting for me when I stumbled home, her usually calm face etched with worry and something that looked like grief. She handed me a letter written in her careful script. I always knew this day would come. There are people who can help you, but you have to leave. Tonight. She pressed a small, intricately carved pendant into my palm, warm to the touch and humming with the same energy I'd felt pour out of me during the attack. This belonged to your father, her note continued. Find the others. Trust no one else. I wanted to argue, to tell her I wouldn't leave her behind, but the sound of howling in the distance, werewolves probably drawn by the magical disturbance, convinced me that staying would only put her in more danger. I kissed her forehead, promised I'd come back for her, and ran into the night with nothing but the clothes on my back and a power I didn't understand coursing through my veins. The others Mira had mentioned found me before I found them. I'd been hiding in an abandoned barn about 10 miles from home when she appeared, a woman who looked maybe 25 with dark hair and the kind of pale beauty that immediately screamed vampire. But instead of attacking me, she tossed me a bottle of water and settled against the opposite wall like she planned to stay a while. You look terrible, she said matter-of-factly. When's the last time you ate? I stared at her, every instinct screaming at me to run. You're a vampire. Very observant. She pulled an apple from her jacket and rolled it across the barn floor to me. I'm also the person who's been keeping 3 different hunting parties from tracking you down for the past 6 hours, so maybe save the hostility for someone who deserves it. Why would you help me? Her smile was sharp and bitter. Because I hate my own kind more than you ever could, And you, Kael Ashborne, represent the best chance we've had in 300 years to make them pay for what they've done. Her name was Lyra Blackthorn, and she'd been a vampire for over 2 centuries, turned against her will during the Great Purges when the Vampire Kings systematically hunted down and eliminated every wizard bloodline they could find. She'd spent the last 100 years building a network of supernatural outcasts and rebels, all united by one goal, bringing down the Night Dominion. The Night Dominion? I asked as we made our way through the forest toward what she called a safe house. The Vampire Ruling Council, she explained, moving through the underbrush with inhuman grace while I stumbled along behind her. 5 ancient vampires who've controlled the supernatural world since they wiped out your people. They rule through fear, crushing anyone who threatens their power structure. And you think I can stop them? She glanced back at me and for a moment, her expression softened. I think you're the first wizard born in 3 centuries, which means you have access to power they can't comprehend or control. Whether you can stop them depends entirely on whether you're willing to learn how to use it. The safe house turned out to be a sprawling mansion hidden deep in the Whisperwood, protected by wards so old and complex that even approaching it made my newly awakened magical senses tingle. Lyra led me through gardens filled with plants that glowed softly in the moonlight and up to a front door carved with symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Welcome to Sanctuary," she said, pushing open the door. "Try not to let the others intimidate you too much." The first other I met was pacing in the front hall like a caged animal. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that belonged in action movies, but there was something wild about his eyes that made it clear he wasn't entirely human. When he saw me, he stopped pacing and inhaled deeply. "So you're the wizard boy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You smell like power and fear. Interesting combination." "Kael, meet Marcus Stone," Lyra said with obvious fondness. "He's a werewolf with anger management issues and a tendency to state the obvious." Marcus grinned, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "I prefer emotionally direct. And I was banished from my pack for refusing to bow down to vampire authority, not for anger management issues." "The banishment might have had something to do with you challenging the Alpha to single combat," a new voice added from the doorway. The woman who entered the room was perhaps the most beautiful person I'd ever seen, but it was a strange, otherworldly beauty that made my eyes water if I looked at her too directly. Her hair was white as snow and seemed to move in a breeze I couldn't feel, and her skin had a faint luminescent quality that suggested magic ran through her veins like blood. "And you must be the witch," I said, trying not to stare. She smiled, and I felt something flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the fact that she was absolutely stunning. Sage Night Whisper. "And yes, I'm a witch without a coven before you ask. Turns out my sisters didn't appreciate my opinions about vampire collaborators." "She burned down their sacred grove," Marcus added helpfully, "with all their vampire allies still in it. They were torturing shapeshifter children," Sage said with a shrug that suggested she'd do it again without hesitation. "I have strong feelings about child welfare. I liked them immediately. These 3 broken, exiled, dangerous people who'd somehow found each other and decided to fight back against a system that had discarded them. For the first time since discovering what I was, I didn't feel quite so alone." "So," I said, settling into a chair that was probably older than I was, "what happens now?" "Now," Lyra said, her expression growing serious, "we train you. The power you unleashed tonight was raw and unfocused, impressive, but ultimately useless against enemies who've had centuries to perfect their techniques. You need to learn control, strategy, and most importantly, you need to understand what you're really capable of." "Which is?" The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I got the distinct impression there were things they weren't telling me. "That," Sage said carefully, "depends on what kind of wizard you choose to be." The training began the next morning and was unlike anything I could have imagined. The mansion's library was filled with books I couldn't read, written in languages that had died with my people, but when I touched them, knowledge flowed into my mind like water finding its level. I learned about the Infinity Core, the magical seed every true wizard carried in their chest like a second heart. I discovered that the visions I'd been having were ancestral memories, the accumulated knowledge of every wizard who'd come before me preserved in my bloodline. But most importantly, I learned about power, real power, the kind that could reshape reality with a thought. "Magic isn't about flashy spells or dramatic gestures," Lyra explained as she watched me practice moving objects with my mind. "It's about will imposed on reality. The stronger your will, the more you can accomplish." "But will toward what end?" Sage added, her tone carrying a warning I didn't understand yet. Power without purpose is just destruction waiting to happen. Marcus, meanwhile, focused on the more practical aspects of my education, like how to fight when magic wasn't an option and how to survive when everyone wanted you dead. He was a brutal but effective teacher, and I learned quickly that werewolf strength was nothing to take lightly. The thing about being hunted, he said as he helped me up from the ground after a particularly humbling sparring session, is that eventually, you have to decide whether you want to keep running or start hunting back. What did you choose? I asked, wiping blood from my split lip. His smile was all teeth and predatory intent. What do you think? As the weeks passed, I found myself growing closer to all three of my teachers, but it was Sage who occupied most of my thoughts. She was brilliant and fierce, with a quick wit and an even quicker temper when it came to injustice. More than that, she saw something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. Potential for something greater than revenge or survival. You're not just the last wizard, she told me one evening as we sat in the mansion's garden, surrounded by plants that responded to her presence like pets eager for attention. You're the first wizard of a new age. That means you get to choose what that age looks like. What if I choose wrong? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest alongside my power. She reached over and took my hand, her fingers warm and electric against my skin. Then you choose again. That's what being human means, the chance to keep trying until you get it right. The first real test of my abilities came 2 months into my training. A vampire hunting party had tracked us to the Whisperwood, and while the mansion's wards kept them from approaching directly, they'd set up a perimeter and were clearly planning something. They're not here to capture you, Lyra said grimly as she studied the situation from the mansion's tower room. These are Dominion executioners. They've been sent to kill you. How many? Marcus asked, already checking his weapons. 12 vampires, plus what looks like a summoned demon for backup. Lyra's expression was stone-cold fury. They're not taking any chances. Good, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Neither are we. The battle that followed was my first real taste of what it meant to be a wizard in a world that wanted wizards extinct. I'd been practicing with my power for weeks, learning to focus it, control it, shape it into something useful rather than just destructive. But facing actual enemies, feeling their killing intent pressing against my mind like a physical weight, that was different. The infinity core in my chest blazed like a star as I called on power I was still learning to understand. Golden light poured from my hands, my eyes, my very skin, and where it touched the attacking vampires, they burned. Not with fire, but with something purer and more fundamental, the antithesis of their unnatural existence. But it was when the demon materialized in front of me, all shadow and malice and ancient hunger, that I discovered what I was truly capable of. Instead of fleeing or fighting, I reached out with my magic and simply unraveled it. The demon's form dissolved like smoke, its essence scattered to the winds as if it had never existed at all. The vampires who saw it happen turned and fled, terror overriding their predatory instincts. Well, Marcus said into the sudden silence, that was new. Sage was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Kael, do you understand what you just did? I destroyed a demon, I said, though I was starting to realize it was more complicated than that. You didn't destroy it, Lyra said quietly. You unmade it. You reached into the fundamental structure of reality and decided it shouldn't exist anymore. The weight of that settled over me like a cold blanket. Is that normal wizard magic? No, Sage whispered. That's creation magic. The power to make and unmake existence itself. That night, after the others had gone to sleep, I found myself in the library reading accounts of the old wizard wars. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The wizards hadn't been the noble guardians of balance I'd imagined. They'd been conquerors, using their reality-shaping powers to dominate and enslave other magical species. The vampires who destroyed them hadn't been motivated by evil. They'd been fighting for their survival. Heavy reading? Sage's voice made me jump. She stood in the doorway, her white hair gleaming in the lamplight. Did you know? I asked. About what the wizards really were? She came and sat beside me, her presence both comforting and electric. We suspected. The histories written by the victors aren't always complete, but there were hints. The vampires were right to hunt us down, I said, the words tasting like ashes. We were monsters. Some of you were, she agreed. But that doesn't mean you have to be. I looked at her, this beautiful, fierce woman who'd somehow seen past what I was to who I could become. What if the power corrupts me? What if I become like them? She leaned closer, her hand finding mine in the lamplight. Then I'll stop you, she said simply. We all will. That's what love means, holding each other accountable for who we choose to be. Well, the word hung in the air between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I'd been feeling it for weeks now, this growing connection that went beyond friendship or attraction. Sage was brilliant and dangerous and absolutely committed to doing what was right even when it was hard. She challenged me, supported me, and somehow made me want to be better than I was. "I love you too," I said, and kissed her in the flickering lamplight of a library filled with the ghosts of my ancestors' mistakes. The next few months passed in a blur of training, planning, and stolen moments with Sage. We were preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Night Dominion, but I was also trying to figure out how to use my power without becoming the thing we were fighting against. The key, Lyra explained during one of our strategy sessions, is remembering that power is a tool, not a purpose. The old wizards forgot that. They started believing their own mythology, thinking that having power meant they deserved to rule. "But you could rule," Marcus pointed out to me. "With your abilities, there's not much that could stop you if you decided to reshape the world according to your vision." "That's exactly why I can't," I replied. "The moment I start thinking I know what's best for everyone else is the moment I become everything the wizards were accused of being." Sage smiled at me from across the table, pride and love shining in her eyes. "That's why this might actually work. You understand that true strength comes from choosing not to use your power, not from using it." The final confrontation came sooner than we expected. The Night Dominion, tired of playing games, decided to force the issue by threatening everyone I cared about. They took Mira. The message arrived via a raven with eyes like burning coals. "The woman who raised you awaits in the Obsidian Tower. Come alone or watch her suffer for your cowardice. You have until midnight." "It's a trap," Lyra said unnecessarily. "Of course it's a trap," I replied, already preparing to leave. "But they have Mira." "We're coming with you," Sage said firmly. "They said to come alone." Marcus laughed harshly. "Since when do we do what vampires tell us to do?" The Obsidian Tower had been the seat of vampire power for 3 centuries, a spire of black stone that reached toward the sky like an accusatory finger. It stood in the center of Raven Cross, the vampire capital, surrounded by streets that hadn't seen sunlight since the Night Dominion took power. We approached at sunset, when the vampires would be at their strongest but before they'd had time to fully prepare for us. The plan was simple: get in, rescue Mira, and get out before the full weight of vampire power could be brought to bear against us. Of course, no plan survives contact with the enemy. The moment we entered the tower, we were surrounded. Not by the handful of guards we'd expected, but by what looked like every vampire in the city. They filled the great hall like a sea of pale faces and glittering eyes, all focused on me with a mixture of hatred and fascination. At the center of it all, seated on a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, was the Lord of the Night Dominion himself, Valdris Morningbane, the vampire who'd orchestrated the wizard genocide 3 centuries earlier. He looked exactly like what he was: ancient, powerful, and utterly without mercy. His hair was silver white, his skin pale as moonlight, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. When he smiled, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Kael Ashborne," he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast hall. "The last wizard. Do you know how long I've waited for this moment?" "Where is Mira?" I demanded, golden light beginning to gather around me as the Infinity Core responded to my emotions. "Safe," he said with a dismissive wave. "For now. But her continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. What do you want?" Valdris leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. "I want you to join us." That wasn't what I'd expected. "What?" 300 years ago, I led the campaign to exterminate your kind because they threatened the natural order. Wizards with their reality-shaping powers were too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely." He stood, his presence filling the room like a physical force. "But you're different. You have power beyond anything I've ever seen, and more importantly, you have control. You could be the bridge between our kinds, helping to establish a new order with both vampire and wizard at its head." "You want me to help you rule the world," I said flatly. "I want you to help me save it," he corrected. "Do you have any idea what chaos would result if word spread that wizards had returned? Every supernatural species would start positioning for war, human governments would panic, and millions would die in the crossfire. Better to maintain stability under proven leadership." It was tempting, I had to admit. The offer of power, of belonging, of never having to worry about being hunted again. All I had to do was compromise everything I believed in. "And if I refuse?" His smile turned predatory. "Then you die here, tonight, along with your friends and the woman who raised you." The last wizard bloodline ends and the world continues as it has for 3 centuries. Some choice, Marcus growled from beside me. It's the only choice that matters, Valdris replied. Submit or die. That's when Mira appeared, not as a prisoner, but walking freely beside one of the Dominion lords. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by secrets she'd carried for too long. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. I'm so sorry, Kael. Mira can speak? Sage whispered. She's been able to speak all along, Valdris said with cruel amusement. She simply chose not to. Tell him, Mira. Tell the boy what you really are. Myra's shoulders slumped in defeat. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I'm a vampire, Kael. I have been for over 400 years. I was one of the scouts who helped locate wizard families during the purges. The words hit me like physical blows. The woman who'd raised me, loved me, taught me everything I knew about healing and growing things, she was one of them. One of the creatures who'd murdered my family, my entire species. But, she continued, her voice breaking, when I found you as a baby, something changed. You were so small, so innocent, and I couldn't do it. I took you and ran, spent years learning to suppress my vampiric nature so I could raise you as my own. She's been our spy for 19 years, Valdris added conversationally. Keeping us informed of your development, ensuring you'd never become a threat to the established order. Is any of it real? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you ever actually care about me? Myra's face crumpled. Everything I felt for you was real. You're the sun I never had, the light that taught me I could be more than what I was made to be. I love you, Kael. That's why I couldn't let them kill you. The infinity core in my chest was burning now, power radiating from me in waves that made the air itself shimmer. I could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on me, the moment when I would have to choose who I wanted to be. I could destroy them all. Every vampire in this room, possibly every vampire in the world. The power was there, waiting for me to embrace it. I could remake reality itself, create a world where wizards ruled and vampires served, where justice, my justice, was the only law that mattered. Or I could choose something harder. You're right about one thing, I said to Valdris, my voice carrying across the silent hall. The world would descend into chaos if wizards returned as conquerors. But that doesn't mean the current system should continue either. I stepped forward, power crackling around me like golden lightning. You've ruled through fear for 3 centuries, crushing anyone who threatened your authority. That ends tonight. You would make yourself king instead? Valdris asked mockingly. No, I said, and felt Sage's hand slip into mine, her presence grounding me in the choice I was making. I would make myself the last wizard. I reached for the deepest part of my power, the part that could reshape the fundamental nature of reality. But instead of using it to destroy or conquer, I did something that no wizard in history had ever attempted. I gave it away. The golden light that had been gathering around me suddenly exploded outward, washing over every person in the hall. But instead of burning or destroying, it changed them. I reached into the core of what made each supernatural creature what they were and rewrote it, not to make them human but to make them whole. Vampires who hadn't felt warmth in centuries suddenly had beating hearts. Werewolves gained control over their transformations. Witches found their power no longer bound by the limitations of covens and bloodlines. For the first time in millennia, the supernatural world was free to choose what it wanted to be instead of being trapped by what it had always been. The effort nearly killed me. I felt the infinity core crack and break as I poured everything I had into that single, impossible act of transformation. But as I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, I saw the faces around me and knew it had been worth it. Valdris stared at his hands in wonder, no longer pale and cold but warm with life. What have you done? I've given everyone a choice, I said weakly. You can choose to be the monster you've always been, or you can choose to be something better. But the choice is yours now, not your nature's. Mira was at my side in an instant, her own transformation evident in the way color had returned to her cheeks. Kael, you've destroyed yourself. The infinity core was never meant to last forever, I finished. That's why they called it the infinity core. It was infinite potential, not infinite duration. It was always meant to be used up, transformed into something else. Sage knelt beside me, her eyes wet with tears. You beautiful, stupid, self-sacrificing fool. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've ended the age of wizards, I said simply, and started the age of choice. The aftermath was chaos, but it was the good kind of chaos. The kind that comes when oppressive systems collapse and people suddenly realize they're free to build something better. Some vampires chose to embrace their newfound humanity, while others clung to the old ways. But they could no longer compel obedience through supernatural fear, which changed everything. The Night Dominion crumbled within weeks, replaced by a council that included representatives from every supernatural species. It wasn't perfect, nothing involving that many different perspectives ever was, but it was fair in a way the world hadn't seen in centuries. As for me, I was no longer the last wizard. I was just Kael Ashborne, a young man with a strange past and an uncertain future. The power that had defined me for so brief a time was gone, used up in that single moment of choosing transformation over domination. Do you regret it? Sage asked me one evening as we walked through the gardens of what had once been the Obsidian Tower but was now the Hall of Voices, where the new council met. Regret what? Losing the power? Regret giving up the chance to reshape the world according to your vision. I considered that as we stopped beside a fountain that sparkled in the moonlight. I did reshape the world according to my vision. I just chose a vision where everyone gets to have a say in what comes next. She smiled and kissed me, her lips warm and electric against mine. That's why I love you. You had the power of gods and used it to make everyone else free instead of making yourself king. Besides, I said, pulling her closer, I got everything I really wanted out of the deal. Which was a world where we can choose to be together without anyone trying to kill us for it. Mira, who had been tending the healing herbs nearby, old habits dying hard even in her transformed state, looked up and smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her truly happy since the night everything changed, and I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not conquest or domination, but the simple freedom to love and be loved without fear. The last wizard was dead. In his place stood something better, a man who had chosen hope over power and love over revenge. And in a world full of people learning to make their own choices, that felt like exactly the right kind of magic. 6 months later, I married Sage in a ceremony that would have been impossible under the old regime. A human-raised former wizard and a rogue witch, surrounded by friends who included a reformed vampire and a packless werewolf. Mira officiated, her voice strong and clear as she spoke the words that bound us together. Do you, Kael Ashborne, promise to love, honor, and challenge each other to be better than you are today? I do, I said, looking into Sage's eyes and seeing our future reflected there. Do you, Sage Nightwhisper, promise the same? I do, she replied, her voice steady and sure. Then by the power vested in me by the new council and the choice you've made to build a life together, I pronounce you husband and wife. As we kissed under a canopy of stars, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete and perfect peace. The power was gone, the destiny fulfilled, the great war ended. What remained was simpler and infinitely more precious: love, family, and the quiet satisfaction of a choice well made. The age of wizards was over. The age of wonder was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel for more captivating audiobook stories that will transport you to worlds beyond imagination. Your support means everything to creators like us who are passionate about bringing these magical stories to life. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart, share it with fellow lovers of supernatural romance, and let us know in the comments what kind of mystical adventure you'd like to hear next.